Hi, so I'm Julie Robinson. I'm one of the occupational therapists here. I've been working here for about 20 years. And I primarily work with children. Another good thing for you to know is that I'm the person here who does all the intake calls. So I don't know how many of you are, coming here out of a perspective, question if you want to come here for services. But after the end of this, if you want, you can reach me by phone afterwards, and you'll know that you're talking to me. So one of the questions I have is, how many of you are parents? All parents.
That's an interesting question. How many?
Children or parents? Right. Parents of sensory children was the next question. Okay. And how many of you are professionals coming in, and what type of professionals are you?
I'm a dean of students, special ed coordinator.
Okay. And where do you work?
At the Rashi School.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
OT.
You're OT. And where do you work? At home. Great. So I like to do my talks very kind of informally, and I have this PowerPoint here that I will use, but if you have questions or thoughts or comments, feel free to chime in. You can derail me a little bit, and I'll probably come back to where I was before. So really what I want to do is just give you an overview of sensory integration and what we do here at OTA, and sort of how it applies to daily life of all the kids and adolescents and adults that we're talking about. So basically sensory integration, it's the organization of information of all the senses that come at us from the environment, and how we adapt to those sensations that are coming in to use them for the demands of our daily life. It's part of our enjoyment of life, because if we're not effectively processing sensory information, we're probably in a pretty uncomfortable state where things don't feel good or don't feel right in our bodies. And the theory of sensory integration was developed by Dr. Jean Ayres. She was an occupational therapist and a psychologist. She developed the theory about 40 years ago, which, if you think about it in the context of a lot of other medical professions, it's pretty new. So we're constantly learning about it over time, and through our work with children, through the research that we do with children. I think a lot of people feel at this point that there's not a lot of research to back up the effectiveness of sensory integration, but that's actually not so accurate. And that as time goes on, there is more and more research that's going on constantly all the time to show the effectiveness of what we do. So sensory integration and sensory processing is important for any number of functions in our daily life, and one of the most prominent primary ones is sensory regulation, and our ability to sort of stay even throughout the day so that we can participate with people and participate in daily activities. It affects our communication, right? So we talk a lot about kids who are on the spectrum, who might have difficulties with verbal communication and socialization. And a lot of times, difficulties with sensory processing can impact that. And we find that when we can get those kids regulated more easily, their communication improves along with it. It has a definite, clear impact on the development of our motor skills. Children and adults who are not processing information adequately, it will have an impact on motor skills and motor development. So a lot of the clients who we see here in the office, in addition to parents coming and raising concerns about regulation, have concerns about motor development as well. It impacts our purposeful interaction with the environment. And it has an impact on our cognitive development as well. And a lot of times we'll talk to parents and we see that kids are having difficulties with their academic performance. Not to say that all of them are due to sensory processing issues, but there's definitely a contributing factor there. A lot of individuals who are thought to have behavioral issues or cognitive difficulties, attentional issues, psychological difficulties, anxiety, depression, a lot of times can have underlying issues with sensory processing. And if we look at all of the clients who are here in our office, I would estimate that a majority of them have some of these complaints or symptoms or difficulties as well. Because they just, like they say, you can't get in the ballpark to function as they need on a daily basis. We're not 100% sure where difficulties with sensory processing stem from, but these are some of the theories right here. Sometimes in utero experiences, we tend to have a lot of clients who've been IVF, babies, twins, prematurity, different, traumas or difficulties with birth or complications with birth. Deprivation and abuse is another significant one. We see a lot of times when children are adopted internationally and they've lived in environments where they don't have a lot of ability to explore from a sensory perspective, that they tend to have some difficulties processing information once they come out of these orphanages and they're out in the real busy world that surrounds them. Abuse and trauma is a definite contributing factor, and I think as more time goes on, particularly here at OTA, we're starting to deal with a lot more clients who have trauma histories. And I think what happens with them is that they have so many negative sensory experiences that sensory stimuli in general can tend to be an assault to their system. And so we have to work very sensitively whenever we know we have somebody who has a trauma history. I think this is a big one, the changes in our society. I think back to when I was a kid and we were all kids, how much time we had to be outside and run around and recess. And, now everybody's life is scheduled and busy, and kids are hooked into their computers and their visual stimuli all the time. I think a lot of us feel like that's definitely a contributing factor. And I think even concerns about preservatives and food additives and all the toxins that kids are exposed to now that weren't before. There's not a whole lot of research at this point to really back it up, but I'm anticipating that some of that's going to come down the road. This is another one a lot of people don't think about. If you go out to the playground now and you look at the equipment that's out on the playground, and you think back to all the equipment that we had when we were kids. We had those spinning merry-go-rounds and seesaws and all the things that we bumped our heads on and broke our arms on and, injured ourselves on are no longer on playgrounds anymore because of liability. Kids can climb, but if you go out to most school playgrounds, they don't have swings on them anymore because schools are concerned that kids are going to fall off and get hurt. Jane Kumar, who's the owner of OTA for a while, has been trying to go through getting some of the old equipment that we all used to have out on playgrounds more, because I think it really helps children's development. And I think the other one, a big one, is increased screen time. Kids just sitting in front of a screen, being sedentary, I think has an impact on sensory processing as well. So everyone in this room, I'm sure, knows of the typical 5 senses that we all talk about. Smell, taste, hearing, vision, and touch. There are 2 hidden senses that OTs will often talk about with sensory integration. One of them is the sense of proprioception, which is essentially your body awareness. All of your muscles and your joints have receptors in them that tell them, is my arm up or is my arm down? It allows you to do things like touch your nose with your eyes closed, or to get through the environment when you can't quite see where you're going. It impacts your body awareness and your coordination. Those receptors respond to heavy work and deep pressure. So if you think about this, when you're jumping on the floor, you can feel your feet, right? If you're pushing against something, you can really feel your arms. That's the sensory input that feeds your proprioceptive system, and that has an impact on your coordination and your motor skill. It impacts how much force you use. So if I want to pick up a feather in comparison to a heavy book, just by looking at it, my muscles get that innate sense of what exactly needs to fire to pick those things up. And then there's the vestibular system, which is your awareness and your sensory perception of your head moving through space. So speed and directionality and balance, changes in head position. One of the examples that I often use with with parents who, when we're talking about their kids who have vestibular issues, is, sometimes you imagine you're sitting in a car and you're at a stoplight and all the cars next to you are stopped. And then all of a sudden, the car that's on your right moves. And sometimes it plays that little trick on you. You don't know if it's actually you moving or if it's the car next to you. That's your visual system and your vestibular system working together to process information. And if you can sort of think of that example as one manifestation of a child who's not processing sensory information accurately, and you try to, transfer that into their daily life, how it must feel to move through the environment, how it must feel to have people walking around on the playground when you're trying to get from here to there. It can be pretty complex. So all those systems have to work effectively, but they have to work effectively together as well. And here's a good example of proprioception. He says, I say it every time, watch your head, Frank, watch your head, but do you listen? And here he's banging into the wall. And I think of that as an example of, the kids we see who don't use their vision when they move through space. And we see them all the time here. They come into the clinic and they open a door and run into a room without knowing that they have to scan and see, well, is somebody on a swing over there, or what's going on around me? So safety awareness and body awareness can be a big issue for these kids. One of the first things that we look at when we're doing an evaluation and we talk to parents is called sensory modulation. So when you have sensations coming in from the outside world, all the sights and touch and sound from around you, what you need to be able to do is to filter out the unnecessary stimuli. So example, I hear a baby cooing over here, or I hear the sound of the projector over here kind of whirring in the background, or there's people walking past in the hallway. I know that those sensations are there, but I'm able to filter them out enough to be able to focus on my conversation and to continue doing what I'm doing. When individuals can't process sensory information, that's something that's really difficult for them. And it can impact attention. It can impact behavior significantly. A lot of parents will talk to us about, they find their kids' behavior to be somewhat inconsistent depending on the environment they're in. Busy settings like birthday parties and gyms and family gatherings can be really difficult because these kids can't filter out all that unnecessary stimuli. I think what happens is a lot of kids who have these difficulties will try to control their environment to create as much predictability as they can. So we get the kids who will only eat white food, or they'll take a bath, but the water has to be a certain specific temperature, or I'm only wearing sweatpants and you can't make me wear anything else, right? These kids try to control their environment so that they can maintain their comfort. And there's not always logic in those kind of behaviors when they come out. I have parents who will say to me, well, why will he eat this but not that? It doesn't make sense to me. Why will he wear short sleeves but not long sleeves? And I think especially kids who can't recognize their own sensory systems and how they feel, can't always put a name to what bothers them. It's just that something is there. Some of them become very fearful or withdrawn. We get a lot of kids who don't want to be out on the playground. It's not a pleasurable experience for them. There's other kids who tend to kind of shut down and stay on the outskirts, and they seem to be very sedentary and very calm. They're in an uncomfortable state. And then there's sort of the other extreme of the very active kids who are constantly seeking movement all the time to try to regulate themselves. And that's all sensory modulation. So is that making sense? Yeah? Modulation impacts your ability to calm yourself. So again, we talk about a lot of clients who have difficulty self-soothing. My child has a tantrum and it lasts 2 hours and I don't know what to do to settle them down. Responses to sensation, like I said before, ability to focus and attend. And another big one is appropriate reactions to challenging situations. So again, these are the kids who don't like to try new things because it's an assault. on their system. They just want to keep things constant all the time. You take them to a new class, like a class or a sports class, and they get totally overwhelmed. A new environment. Something unexpected that happens, like a family member who comes up and squishes their cheek, you know, can be a challenging situation. We talked about before, you have to filter out sensations to attend to the information that's relevant. One thing that we see as a real sign of modulation is what a lot of people will refer to as sensory defensiveness, which is a general oversensitivity to sensory stimuli, an oversensitivity to sounds, loud sounds, an oversensitivity to touch sensations. Kids who don't like bright lights. And what we'll see as a behavior is that kids who have this defensive presentation will often go into fight, flight, or fright types of responses when they are presented with uncomfortable stimuli. So the first thing they'll do is get a little scared. Yeah, I don't really like this, I don't want to do it. If they can't get away from the stimuli, the next thing they want to do is try to get away. So these are the kids who are running to try to get out the door, kids who bolt out of the classroom. And when that doesn't work, and they can't get away, you tend to get a fight response, and those are the kids who tend to be a little bit more aggressive. And who have more significant issues. And then distractibility is another big one. We sort of touched on this before. Like I said, sensitivity to tactile input, visual, auditory, smell, and taste. A lot of these kids have significant feeding issues, limited diets, failure to thrive because they can't tolerate new tastes and smells and textures. And movement sensitivities. And the good news is that there's things that we can do about all of it to help and cut down on kids' sensitivities to stimuli in their environment. This is a chart where I find a lot of families will find this very useful. So when we're talking about modulation, we look at what we call arousal. So your arousal is sort of your state of activity throughout the day. We're all sitting in here and our arousal is appropriate because we're focused. Some of us might be on the low end because it's kind of the end of the day and we've been thinking and doing stuff all day, but you're still within a window of normal, okay? So this is kind of the optimal, and you can see this is sort of as the day goes on. You have, it's a wave, you know, it goes up and down. Sometimes you're a little higher, sometimes you're a little lower. You might even have periods of time when you go into this sort of higher state, but you come back down. You're able to settle yourself to sleep at the end of the night, and you're okay. But kids who have sensory issues can't do that. One little stimuli, say this is the beginning of the day and the alarm goes off and your child wakes up and their sibling comes up to them and starts needling them, you know, tapping them on the shoulder. Well, that's a sensory assault to their system, and they go from here to here right away into high arousal. And then they get on the school bus and it's really loud and it's bumping up and down and everybody's close together and people are bumping into each other and it just goes up and up and up. And then you might maybe have a fire drill or a transition between classrooms where there's a lot of kids in the hall and jostling around, where they go to PE, or in those big gymnasiums where the noise is reverberating off of the walls. You know, they're just up here all the time. And those are kids who are going to manifest themselves with a very high activity level. They look agitated. They feel like they're not comfortable in their bodies. They're irritable. They don't always comply. They don't want to do what people ask them to do. They're getting into some mischief. In its most extreme case, people will enter a state of shutdown, which then becomes sort of like there's so much stimuli coming into my system and I'm so uncomfortable, I can't respond to anything anymore. Right? So then, the child seems really tired. They're not responding to you when you talk to them. They just seem kind of lethargic and lazy and they don't want to do anything. A lot of times it's because they're in a state of shutdown. It's like they're in so much overload they just can't tolerate anymore. And a more significant number of people with sensory issues sort of fit into those two categories. There are people who are more low arousal people, and those are the ones who just seem tired all the time. You know, kids, you gotta light a firecracker under them to get them to go out to the playground and explore or play with their friends. This tends not to be as common as the kids who are in high arousal and shutdown. And then you can look at it and you think, well, how do you know if somebody's in shutdown or low arousal? And that, I think, is something that takes a really trained eye of somebody who can put together all the puzzle pieces and figure out all that information to try to determine which it is. Because the way that you would work with them and the way that you would treat them would be very, very different. Yeah. Any questions so far? Yeah.
So, like Maeve,
Yeah.
you know, she wanted you, like, we'd come here and get her to go and go and go, and she'd love it. So is that, I don't know if that's like you were describing sensory overload as, no, too much.
Right.
And the other one, the opposite of that is, not, but Maeve was like, I need more. So I didn't hear either of those being.
So a lot of kids who have sensitivities to sensory stimuli, touch and sound and visual inputs, will use movement as a way to regulate themselves. Okay? And you can see those differences. Well, there's certain stimuli. I don't like to touch cotton balls, or I don't like the way certain things feel to me, or I don't like to take a bath. Well, movement tends to be very regulating for anyone, regardless of the sensory issues. And I'm not saying 100% of the time, because there are certain kids who can get very overstimulated with too much movement. But I'll touch on this a little bit more later. Your vestibular sense and your proprioceptive sense tend to be two very organizing systems for a lot of people. So you can use movement to sort of override your discomfort with other areas.
So when we talk about movement because of the possibility of overstimulating, so sort of a calming kind of movement as opposed to go out and run around the block.
Right, and there's
or
all
jump
different
on a
kinds of
trampoline.
movement.
So-
Part of working with an OT, and we'll talk a little bit more about this later with sensory diet, is finding somebody who understands all of those minutia. And how do you figure out which is the right movement for my child? Because everybody has different preferences. Everybody has different things that work for them. I mean, you think of yourselves. What do you do when you're stressed out? Some people tell me around the room what you might do. You run. You do it. Exercise. I clean. Right? There's some people who want to sit down and curl up on a couch and read a book when they're stressed out, who do more of those, calming, centering things. So everybody has their different preferences. Sometimes you try to distract yourself, right? Sometimes you just blow your top and have your own adult tantrum or whatever. And so everybody has their own ways. And part of working with an OT or somebody who's trained in sensory integration is they can help you sort of figure out all those patterns along the way and what's going to work for your child or what's going to work for you. Or, in the case of an adult or an adolescent, you had asked me about, it's a lot of talking to them about, what is your experience? How do you feel in certain environments? What are the places you don't like to go to? What are the places you prefer, to be able to give them some strategies and coping mechanisms for dealing with that. One of the programs we use here, it's called How Does Your Engine Run? So a lot of times we're teaching kids how to think of their bodies like an engine. And sometimes your engine runs too fast, and sometimes your engine runs too slow, and sometimes your engine is just right. And so we point out to kids, I know your engine's running too fast because you're you're pacing around the room and you can't make eye contact with me and you're not even aware of safety. So what are we going to do to slow your engine down? And the hope is that they start to generalize that to other situations and other environments and dealing with other people. In the case of adults, it's some of a similar kind of a thing about, we might not use the engine language, but what does get you going where you're feeling agitated or too fast, and what are we going to do to slow you down, and what are going to be your coping mechanisms for dealing with certain environments. About if there's certain places you don't like to go, is there something you can do from a sensory perspective that makes it tolerable for you?
I have a question. When you have OT, in sensory integration for children, is it something that you have a window and it ends, or do you continue throughout a lifetime?
Are you talking about, do the effects last over time?
Well, probably some of the skill sets that you use might be a little different, you know, with children.
Right.
If your child's diagnosed with sensory processing or sensory integration, they're 5, 6, whatever they might be, you have therapy. Maybe it's a year, maybe you're doing it 2 years, 3 years, but is the expectation that you don't do it throughout adolescence and adulthood?
I think
Or
it's
that
the
you
hope.
should?
I think it's the hope. And I think there are definitely a lot of clients that we work with where we can get them to a place where they're completely functional and they're not needing to do this stuff throughout their life. I think that people who have sensory processing issues are always vulnerable to those difficulties. So under periods of stress or challenge, you know, transitioning off to college, moving, getting married, changing a job, switching schools when you're a kid, meeting new friends, you know, those are all things that can sort of trigger those things. And I think if we've done good jobs as therapists, we've taught the coping strategies. But we'll find that, you know, I know that there are kids that I work with who, they're always going to need to move, you know. They're just not going to be sedentary type people. Maybe they're going to do sports. Maybe they're going to exercise a lot. You know, so some of the tendencies still tend to be there, but you can do things to eliminate or cut down their sensitivities. There are things that you can do to dissipate it. But under periods of stress, things tend to come out a little bit more. And I think we're discovering over time that there's no age that's too late to deal with these issues. There's adults now coming here into the office who have found immense help from the work that we do. And I think part of it is because they're active participants and they're motivated a lot of times to want to change. Definitely. I didn't get to that one yet.
Want to go back? Then go back. There you go.
So the next thing that we talk about is sensory discrimination as a part of sensory integration. And basically, you know, once you've filtered out all the stimuli that you don't need in the environment, you have to figure out what's the stimuli and what are the sensations that you do need. And that's called sensory discrimination. And what that impacts is your skill, okay? It allows you to learn about qualities of sensory input, like size and shape, direction of a noise, your body position, your movement and space. And children or adults who have difficulties with discrimination, it tends to impact their coordination and their motor skill. It can also have an impact on your arousal level, because if you don't have a good sense of your body and space, you might not feel very comfortable. And we talk about it with all the different senses. So touch discrimination or tactile discrimination, say you want to reach into your pocket and take out a penny instead of a dime, using your sense of touch to feel all the different properties of things in your environment. People who can't do that, I almost compare it to like you're walking through life with gloves on. And you're trying to put on your earrings or button something or tie your shoes. You have a diminished sense of how things feel, and that can really impact your fine motor skill. Auditory discrimination. People who have difficulty filtering out background noise, can't tell where a sound came from. We get adults who come in here and say they're driving in their cars and they know they hear a sound of a siren somewhere, but they can't tell where it's coming from to know what to do with their car. Do I go right or left? How do I get out of the way? Visual discrimination can impact visual perceptual skills and ability to maneuver through the environment using your vision safely. And then here's the two big ones again, the hidden ones, the proprioceptive and the vestibular. So the proprioceptive discrimination, like we talked about, impacts your body awareness, how much force you need to use on objects. And that's really going to impact your coordination. And the vestibular discrimination is more how your head is moving through space. So people who have difficulty with that, it can impact their balance and it can impact their responses to movement. We see a lot of inconsistencies in responses to movement. So children who like to move back and forth on a swing but can't tolerate spinning. Children who spin so much you think they're going to be sick and then they get up and walk away as if they're not even dizzy at all. Kids who can't tolerate changes in their head position. So we hear a lot of, if we look at developmental histories, kids who never like to be up on changing tables, up high. Their parents needed to change them standing on the floor. Kids who don't want to use the toilet because they don't like their feet off the ground. Kids who don't like swings. We're never calmed by a car ride or a baby swing. Instead, it revs them up. So those real intense responses to movement. And it can go the other extreme with kids who just seek so much movement they seem like they're never satisfied. And then one of the other things that we look at with sensory integration is motor planning or praxis, which is basically if you were to present a child with a complex or an unfamiliar motor task, can they figure out what they have to do and then get their body to do it, right? And there's so many levels of motor planning. You know, if you think of, and if anybody hasn't seen any of the rooms here, I can show you around later. You walk into a room and you see all this equipment that you've never seen before. You know, how do I know what I want to use? Where am I going to go first? How do I climb onto this piece of equipment? Are there more than one thing that I can do with the same piece of equipment? So one of the tests that we use is we talk about affordances of objects. So we'll give a child like a hula hoop or something like that and see how many different things you can think of to do with a hula hoop. Right, so there's the kids who do the standard. They put it around their waist and then maybe they'll put it around their arm. You know, they'll do standard things. But then there's the other kids who turn it into halos and imaginary themes and things like that. So motor planning can have an impact on play, social skills, confidence to try new things. You know, a lot of kids with motor planning issues, parents are telling us they don't want to go to sports classes, they don't want to play group sports. Those are really stressful for them. They can't tolerate PE class because they don't know how to move their body. Or you send them to karate class and they've quit because the directions are moving too fast. And those are all motor planning issues. And it can have an impact a little bit more on cognitive and academic functioning with motor planning because some of these kids can't generate their own ideas. Or you give them an initial direction to complete a worksheet. They don't know where to start. They don't know what comes first or second or third. They can't verbalize their ideas. So how many times do we hear of kids, well, I know he can write his letters, but when I tell him to write a paragraph, he writes me 3 words, you know, because he can't get his thoughts out on paper. People talk about executive functions, right? Planning and prioritizing and independent work in school and memory. A lot of times we'll find the kids who have difficulties with executive functions have underlying difficulties with motor planning. Difficulty with transitions and change are huge issues for these kids. And like we talked about before, you know, something unexpected happens and for them it's like starting at square one, having to figure out everything all over again. And these kids will like things to be constant. You know, teachers use visuals all the time in preschool about what's the schedule, and where are we going today, and what's happening at 9 o'clock, and what's happening at 9:30. And that's a really good tool to use throughout life. You know, we as adults, we make lists, right? You have your own little visual things that you find to organize yourselves. But once kids get out of elementary school a lot, those things are just sort of pulled away. And now there's a breaking point. So a lot of these kids who might have functioned really well through elementary school move off to middle school, and there's a real break in their academic functioning. And I think a lot of the kids will then need to do independent work and plan and prioritize. And you can have difficulty in one or many of these areas. You know, we do find kids who might have isolated issues. It's just their body awareness, or it's just following verbal directions. And we can always find strengths and weaknesses. And part of what we're doing with looking at motor planning is to find those so that we can educate parents and educate teachers about what are the learning styles of your children, and what are some strategies that you can use to help them along the way. So those are sort of the underlying pieces of sensory integration, and then we talk about intervention. So now we do our assessments and we find out where all these areas of strength and weakness are. Well, now what do we do? We start to provide treatment. Most children or adults will come in once a week for services. There are some kids who come in more intensively. There's a lot of clients here who are also getting services in school or other places. You know, a lot of times schools provide fine motor work and handwriting. Parents want to supplement what it is that they're working on in school, and so they bring them in here. And, you know, the main goal of our treatment is independence, all across the board. Independence with social activities, independence with communication, independence in school, independence with motor skills, independence overall. And those of us who provide sensory integration services really believe that children have to be motivated and intrinsically motivated to learn to grow. And if you were to look in on a treatment session that was going on and you've never seen what we did before, one of the signs of a really good therapist is when you walk into the room and it looks like they're just playing, right? We set up the environment according to the goals that we know that we have, so that when a child walks in a room, they have an enticing, motivating environment to walk into that's going to spur them on to explore. And we really like to try to see them initiating their own activity. And then as therapists, we know our goals in the background. We've spoken to parents and we've done our assessments and we have all our information to be able to sort of tweak activities, right? So that I can increase or decrease the challenge or make something successful for a child.
So when you talk about the interventions that you're doing, you talked about that many of these children, we start to see some cognitive and certainly academic issues. Do you ever provide that sort of intervention, so for the child who really can't get their ideas
For
out?
the child who can't, we do.
So that there's somebody here that's actually trained to work in that area in terms of the combination of academics?
I don't know that we specifically will work on academics in the sense of tutoring or specific skills. I think we do work on the underlying foundations of planning and organization and prioritizing that tend to have a rollover effect, if that makes sense. You know, certainly we want children to direct themselves as much as possible, but there are those kids who can't. You know, kids who are on the spectrum a lot of times just don't have that initiative or that drive to explore, in which case we do set up environments and we make schedules and we use picture symbols and things like that. I think we tend to use that not as a first tool, you know, but definitely we do have the ability to structure it. We do a lot of talking to teachers and consultation with teachers about where kids are struggling in their classrooms and how we can support them with that. One of the things we'll talk about more later on is sensory diet, because that's a big part of the work with these kids. You know, we really just want kids to learn how to use their bodies and learn how to tolerate sensations, and part of it is just through exploration. When we get kids who are really sensitive to certain stimuli, we try to find opportunities within a session to provide them a minute to explore. You know, kids who don't like messy play and are sensitive to touch, you want to try some shaving cream for a couple minutes, or maybe you want to play with a bucket of rice and beans, and to repeatedly present them with those things, because just doing it one time may not result in success. There's a lot of practice and there's a lot of repetition involved too. And so there's sort of two ways of looking at it is, you know, in order to get kids to a place where they are aware of their bodies and they are coordinated, they have to repeat things. A lot of these kids, it takes them longer to learn a motor task than it might take somebody else, right? So there's a lot of that practice and repetition involved. You know, we get kids who like to come in here and they want to set up obstacle courses because there's all the equipment that's there to do it. And you guys, you've all seen it before. They have these grandiose ideas in their mind of where they're going to put equipment and how they're going to move it around the room, and they just talk and talk and talk and talk and talk. And you really have to guide them. You know, what's first, what's second, what's third. And then they might go through it one time and say, okay, I'm ready to go off to another room. No, we're going to try it 3 times before we move on to something else, to encourage that repetition and more automatic motor skill.
Are they visualizing it to do it again?
Some are and some aren't. You know, sometimes we get kids who have all the visual ideas in their head, but they can't enact them. So So we do things like we write down the steps of the obstacle course, or we draw a picture of what the obstacle course might look like, to try to get all those things working together.
And then
at
sequence
the
it
same
too.
time. And then sequence it. Can you remember what was first and second and third? Can you tell a friend who just came in the room how to do that obstacle course? Or do they have to follow you through it? Do you have to show them, or can you tell them?
I had an experience that was interesting when my son was 5. I had him tested and he had sensory integration, and I read Carol Kranowitz's book, The Out of Sync Child, and he was in kindergarten and in private school in a uniform. And every day I tell him to get dressed and come downstairs and have breakfast, and it was a uniform, and I was thinking, how easy can it be? His 3-year-old brother gets dressed every day, and yet he always wanted to just lay and have us dress him. So one day, I read her book, and it said, and I used to open the drawer. These drawers were like just in the eaves in his bedroom, and it would be his uniform in there. It's different parts and pieces of it, but it was there. And I read the book, and it said to take the clothes and put them in order horizontally on the bed, and just point with your finger. And I literally would get so frustrated for almost the whole school year to have him because he'd come down in his pajamas, and we'd be running late, he'd eat, and then I'd go upstairs and help him get in dress. And he came downstairs, I just pointed and he came downstairs, like less than 5 minutes, all dressed, like it wasn't even the same child that had been in my house for a year that I used to say, what's the matter? And I, again, used to think that he was not motivated or lazy or why can't you do this? And it was just unbelievable to me. I just stood there like,
Yeah. That's a really good example.
and he had, once he visualized it, is that what the book said, whether that was true, he did it over.
Right, a lot of times verbalizing for these kids isn't enough. You know, they come in here and they look at a swing that they've never seen before, and I say, oh, well, just sit on it like you're riding a horse, pick one leg up. And they put their belly on the swing or something like that. I have to physically show them how to do it, and sometimes I need to use hand over hand to actually put their body in the position of moving it.
It's fascinating.
So we kind of talked about all this already. And so another really big and very important piece of treatment is working on sensory diet. I think we all realize we have kids here for an hour, maybe 2 hours a week. How often are they with you? How often are they in your classrooms? How often are they in your homes? And in order for progress to be made, it's really important that there's follow-through in those environments. And one of the mechanisms that we use for that is sensory diet. And can I use you as an example of, this is like my star client whose mom is an OT, who we discharged her from services in 6 months, I think. An average is about 18 months. And we've set up a gym in their house with all the equipment that's there, so that when she goes home at the end of the day, all that sensory diet is right there for her. And the progress has been so much faster that it's been astounding. And so sensory diet we think of as like a food diet. You know, what are the things that you have to eat to give yourself sustenance throughout the day? There's sensory things that everybody uses to give them that sustenance throughout the day. I pick at my nails and bite my nails and twiddle with my fingers all day long. If I look around the room, every single one of you is probably do something. You know, some of you are moving your tongues around in your mouths, or twirling your hair, or fiddling with a pencil or a paper clip or something like that. Everybody does those things throughout the day. And I think that that's a really good way for you to try to explore and think about in relation to your kids. Because as adults, you can find acceptable ways to do that don't disrupt people or offend them or assault them in any way. A lot of kids, and particularly kids who have sensory issues, can't do that. They don't understand their own systems enough to be able to make those, to distinguish what's appropriate and what's not. I know I have to move, so I'm just going to bounce up and down in my chair and kick. You know, what's an acceptable way to do it? And so sensory diet is a big part of teaching that for kids and providing them with the appropriate, acceptable opportunities where they can learn the ways to do that. So sensory diets are a collection of sensory-based activities, and they're designed to help improve focus, attention, and involvement in the tasks. They're most commonly schoolwork or mealtime activities. They can be included in an individual's day at set times, but we can also do them at times when we see that an individual is in need of sensory input to sort of get themselves back to a more appropriate state of arousal. Over time, many individuals can become independent with doing that, but like I had said before, at the very beginning when we're dealing with people who have sensory issues, they need a lot of guidance. So you have to kind of start from the bottom and move your way up to independence. And the key components of a sensory diet that we look at are intensity, duration, frequency, and rhythm. So the intensity is how extreme a movement has to be. I have a boy that I work with right now who he has some trauma experiences and he's very, very dysregulated. And he's been coming into my office the past few weeks and literally finding as many things as he can smash into in a very intense way. He wants to knock things over and bang into the walls and smash into balls. And his father had said to me earlier on that day he'd had an upset at school and it took him 2 hours to regroup. And he said, I just need to crash into something, and he couldn't do it. So we talked about, I called the OTs with him at school. We tried to think about what are some acceptable ways that we can do that. We decided we're going to get a big giant therapy ball that he can throw back and forth and play catch with. He wants to let the ball bump into him and let the ball bump into him. And we're going to try it, and we're going to see how it works for a week. And then we're going to talk about it again and see what we have to tweak. And so that's part of making a sensory diet, is recognizing those things can change over time. Different kids have different sensory needs at different times. Like I said before, when they're going through a period of stress or challenge, they might need more than at other times where things are running really smoothly. We're looking at the intensity. Is it enough for him to just bounce a ball in his hand, or does he have to throw it back and forth? Is it enough to just swing slowly on a playground, or do we need to find something where a child can really spin fast to get what it is that they need for their own individual system? We talk about the duration. So how long does a child have to do an activity to have an organizing impact on their system? There's certain kids who can do something for 2 minutes and they're good to go. There are other kids who might need 10 minutes of a movement break or an activity to keep them organized. We talk about how often. Is this a child who needs something every half hour? Is it a child who needs something every hour and a half throughout the day? And the rhythm is more like the rhythm of movement. Fast, slow, steady, and whatnot. And a lot of times we'll make charts. So I have a client right now, I just made a chart for, and what we did was we charted certain target behaviors for her throughout the school day. So one of the things was, social interaction. Is she withdrawn? Is she interacting with adults, or is she interacting with peers as one measure of where her arousal is? How about following directions? Is she independent following directions? Does she need assistance? Or is she just not? Language, we talked about. Is she verbally communicating, or is she silent? Or is she just answering questions? We talk about safety awareness. It's a big one, Is she bumping into obstacles in her path, or is she moving safely through her environment? So we find certain target behaviors and things like that we can use as measures of whether a sensory diet is working or not, and make a chart throughout the day to try to take as much data on it as we can. And sometimes it takes a while. It can take a month to figure out what's an appropriate sensory diet, because you try different things for a week, and you try something else for another week, and you make all those comparisons to figure out the patterns of what works and what doesn't. A really good way to look at sensory needs throughout the day, and I think this has been especially useful for a lot of parents, is we talk about a sensory bank. And you have 7 senses, and everybody starts out with $70 in their bank at the beginning of the day when they wake up, and they're ready to go, right? And there are certain things that happen throughout the day that deplete the money in your bank. And those are the things that tend to be bothersome or poorly tolerated. So for some kids, it can be as simple as getting dressed in the morning if they don't like the feeling of their clothes. Well, that's going to deplete their bank. Going to a big gathering like a birthday party, is that going to take out a little bit of money, or is that going to take out a lot? These kids, that's probably going to, that might take the whole $70 right there. right? And thinking of what are some points that we can earn to replenish the bank, and using sensory activity throughout the day to do that. And you can use small little things, we call them like sensory snacks, that might put $5 here or $5 there. That might be something like playing with a bucket of beans or doing something tactile, or sitting on the couch and watching TV. Movement will tend to put bigger deposits back into the bank. And again, it's different from one person to another. And I think the other important thing to recognize is that when our sleep or our nutrition are off, that automatically puts us at a disadvantage when we wake up in the morning. You know, we talk about a lot of kids here who have, they're picky eaters or they have food intolerances. It can have a really significant impact on their sensory processing. A lot of kids that we refer to nutritionists and dietary specialists and alternative medicine of some kind or another to try to figure out those pieces about food intolerances. There's a lot of these kids.
Sorry, is the 70 just, I mean, is there, I don't understand what the 70 is.
I think we said 70 because there's 7 senses. You figure $70 in a day. It's a good way to remember it. And so,
So not like, there's some optimal 10 per sense or anything.
no, and it's variable from one kid to another. It's sort of a random number.
I have a question about sleep.
Yeah.
You mentioned it. Do you find that a lot of kids with sensory issues have trouble with sleep?
Oh, yeah.
So going to
So
sleep,
there's the kids who
staying
can't
asleep.
settle to sleep. There's the kids who can't stay asleep. There's the kids who need too much sleep. I have the kids who won't go to bed until 11 o'clock at night, wake up at 4 in the morning, raring to go. A lot of sleep disturbances.
That's
a
not-
significant amount of kids. And I think sometimes sensory is the root of it. Sometimes it's not. You know, I think we always want to look at things like apnea or, you know, breathing difficulties or allergies, you know, how those things might impact sleep. And a lot of times those things feed off of each other. You can't always tell. It's sort of like the chicken and the egg. You know, where did it start and where does it end? And a lot of parents, you know, a lot of times when people come in for services, will see improvements with sleep.
That's what I want to do.
Yeah, not all the time,
That's not what I want to do.
but a lot of the time, yeah.
My son who has major sensory integration issues. He, if he doesn't get enough sleep, he can't get it together during the day. He needs 11 hours, so he just can't handle it. He can't handle motor learning or anything. Is that typical?
That's very typical, yeah.
So that's different from the sleep disturbance.
Right. You know, and I hear other things too about parents who say, well, if my child doesn't have something to eat every hour, he's completely undone, you know? So sleep and nutrition are a big part of it.
So I have a question. So having all these issues, I mean, this is part of, you know, dealing and finding the right, you know, services that, will help them. And I think to come back to someone else, like, you know, keep this going, and up until what age? Because this is my concern, that we reach certain point in life that parents will no longer have the control of fixing, you know, like bringing the services, taking it there, because they become more independent, and that's more or less like 15, 16 years old. So, overall, how do we look at, you know, in the long term, because it's sad, but life obviously doesn't arrange, you know,
It doesn't arrange itself around you and your needs, right?
So it was just like, as a parents that we have kids with those different difficulties, I mean, is there any suggestions or studies or something that we should be looking at as to how we kind of like, you know, get them a little more independence into this idea that life is a little harder than
Well, I think some of it is the treatment. So you use the treatment as a mechanism to deal with those neurological foundations of responses to stimuli. So kids who are oversensitive, decreasing those sensitivities. And then the other part is teaching them coping strategies. And ideally, you can get them when you're younger, because kids are much more moldable when they're younger. We often hit a point here, we get clients who are here at 13, 14, 15, this isn't cool, and they don't want to come in here, they want to do sports and they want to be with their friends. That does become a challenging period of time to work with kids. And I think it takes a therapist who can really connect with those things. I don't work with adolescents because I don't have that skill, it's none of my skill set.
Can I share something?
Yeah.
Is it okay to share?
Yeah.
Okay. My daughter goes to Megan, and she has a lot of different issues, but Megan has provided a lot of suggestions that I carry home with me. For example, Emma wouldn't let me cut her toenails. Ever. For like 2 years. And like as a baby, my husband used to have to lay on top of her so that I could do it. And she'd let me file them, but she would not let me cut them. And Megan suggested, if you kind of rub them out to desensitize them, she'll let you. And as soon as I did that, she let me. So I think it's more like that I'm noticing, not that I know, but like that I notice is like she comes for treatment, but the stuff that she does with Megan kind of carries on. And Megan will give me suggestions, and I will go back to those, and they help us through like our day or our weekend, and they're really incredible. I mean, sleep is another one that she's given us huge suggestions, and they work. I mean, she looks forward to coming here, but those suggestions really make a difference when she's with me and I don't know what to do for her.
Right, and so a lot of it is educating parents about what do you do when you're in this situation. And I think some of it is that once you have that awareness in yourself as you're going about your day-to-day environment and your child becomes uncompliant or overwhelmed or is tantruming, you're able to look at it in a different light and start to think, well, wait, what kind of started this? Is my child just legitimately being like just difficult right now? Or is there something that's making me uncomfortable? And how am I going to adjust to that? And what's my response to it going to be? So I think part of it too becomes your own parenting tends to alter as you're more educated about it. And so usually by the time kids are in their teenage years, they're rolling along, and they're fine. They may need to move a lot. They may need to do sports. They may need more quiet time than the average teenager needs. They may have different needs, but by that point, they should be able to sort of verbalize and advocate for themselves a little bit more about what it is they need. So, and you as a family should be able to determine how you're going to fit that into your daily routine. And again, that's through doing some work with a therapist who's going to help you figure those things out, those patterns.
And is teaching a child self-awareness, is that really important?
It's very important, because I think a lot of these kids come to us without that self-awareness. I have one boy I work with who, he's like so adorable, but he wants to play with everybody, he's interested in everybody who walks in his office. He could name anybody here by name. Hi, how you doing? Well, he'll walk into a room and somebody's on a swing, and this kid will just, smash his body onto the other kid with a big hello and like the tightest hug. So the boy he wants to play with can't even breathe, And so, yeah, I'm teaching him a lot of self-awareness. Like, wait a minute, are you looking at this kid's face? Does that face tell you he's comfortable? Does that face tell you he likes it? Well, why do you think he's not comfortable? Is it because you squeezed him too hard? Is it because you're too close? Is it because your engine's going too fast? So definitely teaching kids that self-awareness it's very important. Yeah. Any other questions?
If a child tells you everything about their skin is sensitive, you have no idea how hard it is to look at sensitive skin. Sensitive skin is so hard. Is that them verbalizing that
I think it is.
internally things don't feel right?
I think it is. And so there are techniques, I didn't talk about some of these. So there's some specific techniques that we use with children in treatment. That are things that can be carried over at home. One is something that we use for kids who are sensitive to touch. And some people refer it to as a brushing program or a deep pressure protocol, where we essentially use, it's like a surgical scrub brush. It's very soft. And we're doing almost like a full body massage with that brush. And it's a way to give them some really deep, firm pressure. For a lot of kids, that's comforting. And it can help to override those light touch, tickly clothing sensations and things that bother them. And we find that if we can do that for a really intense period of time for a couple weeks, that it will often dissipate or eliminate some of those sensitivities. We do listening programs with kids who are sensitive to sound, or kids who can't filter out background noise, or who can't discriminate noise, that helps to improve on that. So there's some very specific tools that we can use that we've had some really good successes with like that. We have something some people call the astronaut board, or a visual vestibular program for kids who have a hard time managing their vision as they move through space, or who have oversensitivities or undersensitivities to movement that help to normalize those things. So there are some real specific things, and we try to get those things done on home programs in addition to what we do here, knowing that, you know, we can get this in 5 days a week, the progress is going to be much quicker.
It's interesting that within the same diagnosis umbrella, I guess, that there's these kids who are super sensitive, which is my son, but then on the other hand, he seeks to.
Right, and so kids who tend to be sensitive and oversensitive to a lot of stimuli will generally find certain stimuli that are comforting to them, and usually it's movement. So a lot of kids who are sensitive to touch and sound are huge movement seekers, and they're using it to help regulate themselves a little bit more. And that's sort of a sign that, you know, you probably have to find him a lot of movement opportunities throughout the day. Can you give him a movement break right when he comes home from school before he has to sit down and do his homework? Or some of them a movement break before putting their clothes on in the morning when they're bothered by their touch is a way to help that. Movement break before it's time to settle down to bed. Things like that.
Do most kids have sensory processing issues? Like, is there a percentage of the population, or I can't imagine that every kid is just 100% well regulated. So
No one is, and none of us in this room are.
And I'm just curious, like, at what point does a kid need services, or at what point is just the kids, you know, growing up and every kid's different?
I think it's at a point where it's impacting a family unit. You know, I hear a lot of parents who tell me they're not doing everything they think wants them to do to prevent attention, right? When you're limiting your daily activities as a result of sensory issues, you won't grow, or things you won't do because of it. When your child is limiting some of those things, won't participate in activities that you think should be fun. When it's impacting their ability to sustain their focus in school, you know, if it's impacting their behavior and their, you know, ability to conform to directions in school, if it's impacting their academic performance. You know, a lot of these kids are very bright. We get some kids in here with, you know, superior IQs who aren't functioning in the classroom. You know, that's a point to me that says, yeah, you have to do some services. So I think you just have to look at daily function. I think all OTs are big into the, you know, daily function, how much of an impact it has on you day to day. You know, if it's something that you can kind of simply manage, you're okay. I'm somebody who tends to have a lot of sensory sensitivities. I don't wear turtlenecks.
Yeah, I do too.
You know, like, it doesn't impact my daily life. I'm okay, right? You know, if it came to where I only wore one outfit every day of the week, you know, or I had to wash something 30 times before it was soft enough for me to put it on my skin, that's a sign you might want to do something about it.